We're going to be looking at try and catch. So this is perfect for debugging your code, and there's going to be quite a few examples of this in the upcoming lessons. So how you can do some code debugging, how you can catch and throw errors with JavaScript, and then the try and catch statement with some examples of how to use it within your code. So now there are a lot of different reasons why errors might happen within coding. So there is try and catch statements that allows you to define a block of code to be tested for errors while it's being executed. And if there are any problems, you can use catch statement in order to define a block of code that gets executed if an error does occur. So you can use the try and catch as a combination in order to catch and have errors and be able to handle errors within the code. You can also use the throw statement in order to create a custom error. So essentially, throw will allow you to throw an error and you can customize the error output. So let's create a function. And within this function, I'll just call it tester. And we'll get a value of val. First, do the try. So it just uses the keyword try. And then afterwards, we've got catch. And that's also indicated with the rounded brackets. So what we'll do is we'll try. And we'll check to see first. So if val length is greater than 1 or greater than 0. And actually we're going to do that if it's less than 1. So we'll throw an error if the value of the length is less than 1. So that means that if it's 0, then we want to throw an error, no value. And that's going to be what the response is. So if, and we're just using the not a number function. So this checks to see if a particular value is a number. If it's not a number, then it returns a Boolean value. So check to see if not a number. And if it's not a number, then we throw not a number back as the error. If val is a number, then we're going to convert it to a number and put the value of val in there. And within catch, and within the console, and catch does require an argument, and that argument is going to be the error value that's been thrown. So within the console log, we're going to use the template literals, so the backticks. There was an error, and the response for the error is going to be whatever the value of the error is that we see. And now let's run tester, and we'll put 100 for first test, tester, and hello for the second test. And now let's run the code. So node app21.js, and we see that there was an error, not a number. So that's what gets returned back, that it's not a number. So there was a value that was added in there, and then it threw it that there's not a number. So what happens if we just do tester by itself? So length of undefined. So we also should check to see if value is equal to undefined. And then we throw the value that there's no value. So we get the try. There was an error, no value, not a number. And the only one that actually worked was the one that we've got tester here. So actually also within the error, we'll output whatever the value was, so that we can see that being in the output of the terminal. So there was no value because it's undefined. The error, not a number because the word was hello. But we're okay with tester of 100. So that was able to go through. So we're able to execute the value and output the number. And we also have the keyword finally. So this is a block of code that gets executed whether or not it worked or not. So regardless of try and catch result, we have the finally, which just gets executed regardless. And here, I'll just write done, and then we'll also include the value of val that got passed into the function. Let's clear the terminal and run that one more time. So we ended up getting done 100, or done undefined, and that's the first one that we ran through. Then we got 100, there was an error, and it's completed running. And so you can build within the code itself different ways to handle errors as the code is being executed. And of course, you can create a whole lot more complex logic as needed when you build out your applications. Node is going to make use of async and await quite a bit. So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at JavaScript async and await. So adding async and adding promises to functions, setting a timeout with that function. So giving an example of how that works, adding a promise that gets resolved eventually, and then returning the promise on completion. And then the order of the output. So we're going to see also how this async and await are going to work and the order that it's going to be output. And we're going to be logging this information into the console and then using them once the promise has been completed. So making use of whatever the block of code is or whatever the response back is with the async and await. So I've got some examples coming up. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at async and await. So there's a special syntax that allows promises to work within our code. So let's set up an async function. And the difference between the async function, so you could just put the keyword async in front of the function name. So if you had a function that was just saying hello, without a message there that we're passing, and then within the console, we're outputting whatever the result of the message is. So in order to, whenever we're, and then on top of it, we'll return the message, and then we'll plus and set up a value for a counter, and then increment counter by 1 as we go through and run the function. So this gives us a value that we're returning, and in order to add async, we just prefix the function with async. So we don't change the function name or anything like that. It's still going to be hello, and we can still call to hello, but we've added in the ability to add a promise. So this will always return a promise. And when we're returning the function, whenever the code has finished and completed running, so now we can use it within a promise format. So using the function and invoking the function like this. And once it's completed, and once it's complete running, then we can use then and do something with the response back that's come back from the function itself. So in this case, we can set up our own anonymous function in here, and then within the console, use whatever the return value is. So let's try that, run 22. So we get back undefined and nan, because well, of course we didn't type in a message. So let me type in a message there. And now we get hello world and hello world 1 being returned back. And that's whenever the promise completes. So let's go ahead and we're going to add in a timeout. So set timeout. And the timeout can be 2000. And whenever the timeout is complete, that's when we're going to return the code. And here we'll have a few other functions. And we'll just call it output. And so every time these get called, they can also contain a message as well. And then within the console, we're going to output the value of message. And we'll also output the value of counter. So we're going to be running the code. So for let I equals 0, 1 or 0, and then loop through while I is less than 1. Increment I by 1. And here's we're just going to call to output. And the value that we're passing into output is going to be the value of the message, so the I. So we'll have a constant increment there. And actually I'm going to run hello first, and then we'll create our loop of outputting the content. So going into the terminal, see what happens. So we end up getting hello world, and then we get the full count, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And notice the increments of the counter. So it did go through, it did the increment of the counter, and then it finally did the return. And we were able to use the value that was returned within then once the promise had completed. So what the asynchronous does, and the big difference between the asynchronous and not having the asynchronous, is that it ensures that there's a promise. So it wraps it within non-promises. And when we add await into the function, so await will only work inside a function that's been defined with async. So let me show you how that works. And await will make the JavaScript wait until the promise settles and returns its result. So let's create a result. And we're going to use await. And when await, whenever the promise resolves, then that's when await will kick in and return back the result of the promise. And let's add one more to it. And actually I'm going to turn this into a ternary template literal, so using the backticks. And the curly brackets for the message value. And we'll also have one last value here that we're going to be using for the result. So see what gets returned back within the result. So we've got the timeout on the return. And let's wrap the timeout into a promise. So creating our promise. And this is a new promise. So we have the resolve and the reject. So both of the arguments there. And I'm going to add the timeout in there. And then take the return out and add it into the function. And if this resolves, and we'll just have works, and I'll get rid of the rest of the anonymous function, as we only just need the one works function. So that's what we've got contained within the promise. And then we're returning back the message, the counter, and the result in the end. And actually, before we try it, we won't be able to access the promise before initializing it. So we need to have the promise, the await, after we've declared the promise. So let's try running the code and see what happens. So now we end up with hello world, which is the value that's being passed into hello. And that's being passed into the async function hello. We get the console message, which immediately puts the hello world out. And notice what happened here is that because we've got the promise here, and we've got the timeout within the promise, that we went on to the loop. the loop, because it's running asynchronously, executed all of its values, plus it had the count there being output into the console. So the count kept incrementing. And then lastly, when the promise was completed, we get the original message in mess. We get the current value of counter, and this is the value after it ran through the loop, because counter again is global. And then the result is what we return back here within the timeout as the resolve function when the promise resolved and it properly resolved with the result. So that all gets returned back within that one line of code, and then using then within the promise structure, we can take the value that gets returned, and at that point we're outputting it into the console. And as we go through the upcoming lessons, there's going to be more examples of this. So this was just a simple introduction illustration of how you can use the async and await in order to turn functions and have them work as promises, and then you can use the then keyword in order to return back the results and make use of the results when the promise is complete and they're resolved, and use that within the code.